Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hartmann Family Natural Catuai, Natural Processed Panama from Standout Coffee. There's the container right there. And Standout, based out of Stockholm, Sweden. And this is part 12 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our second coffee from Standout in the Advent Calendar. And this is a fun one for me. As for anybody that does not know, up to this point, I really like to make predictions about the coffee before KaffeBox reveals what each day's coffee is. And in this case, the first prediction I had was that it was going to be a slightly more heavy coffee, as I could definitely tell it was either a natural or an anaerobic coffee. I was leaning a little bit more towards natural, so I kind of ran through what the best case scenario for this coffee might be. And it kind of hit me at that point that Standout has a lot of really interesting coffees in general. So I was hoping that they might have one of their more interesting natural processed coffees. And this actually far exceeded my expectations, as I think a lot of people know that my favorite coffee to review is Panamanian coffees. And even more so, Panamanian coffees that aren't geishas, because they're not really that common from a lot of coffee roasters. So when I found out that this is a natural processed Panamanian Catuai, it definitely caught my interest, and I am very much looking forward to discussing this coffee. And again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with a Chemex, and we went with the standard recipe we found, which is a 15 in to 250 out, or a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. And we opted for 96 degrees Celsius, 205 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, again, it's a little bit more tricky to tell with a natural processed coffee. However, I could definitely tell that this one still is on the lighter side of the spectrum, so you could definitely consider this to be a more light and even Nordic light coffee. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression, and what I immediately was hoping for with this coffee was it didn't come out too heavy. It didn't come out too fermenty. And interestingly enough, that was actually the case. The coffee did not have too much of the fermenty aspects that you experience from natural processed coffees. And it was kind of a coin toss. I didn't know which way this coffee was going to go, because it does have a fermenty aroma to it, both in the whole beans themselves as well as in the brew. So I thought, okay, there's a chance this coffee might be a little heavy, a little overbearing. But luckily for me, it was not the case, and it actually dissipates the more the coffee does cool down. So it's slightly there in the start of the coffee. However, it does come out a lot more clean than that initial impression. Cherry does remain on the forefront. However, it does cool down into a more even, sweet, and cleaner side of that red fruit, which is wonderful for me. That's a really positive start for this coffee. From that point, the cup remains bright, as it is fairly acidic throughout, and I think that's one of the descriptors they had, was this elegant acidity, and I can very much agree with that, because the acidity isn't too overbearing, but it does have a nice bit of brightness. They do have a red apple listed on there, and I oftentimes don't get too many apple-like characteristics from coffee. It's usually the acidity that I'm able to kind of connect with the apple-listed note. The cup does continue to improve with the cool down, as there's this wonderful tropical complexity to the cup, and there's even this kind of level amount of chocolate to the cup. And what I really took away from that experience was the fact that this is what a lot of the more heavy processed Panamanian coffees I've reviewed recently are trying to go for. However, they're just so heavy, they're so overbearing, that all I really taste is the overly heavy chocolate and the overly heavy cherry without any of the clarity to it. So oftentimes I'm not able to pick out the more subtle characteristics to the coffee, mostly because it just overwhelms my palate. And in this case, having this coffee be significantly more clean than those coffees was really important, because it's actually cleaner through the Chemex, and I could justify a higher mark for this coffee through the Chemex. I think I like it a little bit more through the Chemex, just because it does have a slight bit more clarity. And as a result, I'm able to pick out more of those cherry notes to them. This might come as a surprise to people, but I actually love cherry. It's just that cherry in coffee oftentimes overwhelms the rest of the cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 3 level 4s. So let's go through those real quick. The finish, level 4. Yes, and that's actually very important, because I think one of the things they listed on this coffee was it had a very long lasting finish. And luckily for me, most of the overly processed coffees have a much longer lasting finish than this one. This has a really nice even finish to it, so it's not overbearing in any sense, especially in the finish. It's actually a wonderful level 4 in terms of that, because it has a good finish but not a overly long lasting finish. Acidity, level 4. I discussed that briefly. Now, it's not necessarily the brightest cup of coffee, as they mentioned that elegance to the acidity, and that's something I very much agree with because I'm used to maybe Kenyan coffees having a very dominant acidity within the cup. But this actually complements the rest of this coffee very well. So one thing they mentioned is structure, and I can agree with that as well because this coffee doesn't overwhelm you with any of the characteristics in it. So the acidity, even though it's there at that level 4, I think it's a nice acidity, and you could even say it's on the lower side of the level 4 because it's not overwhelming the cup. Berry fruit, level 4, yes, and given that that's kind of complemented by a cleaner cup of coffee, that is also not overbearing, and I've charted so many of these types of coffees in the level 5 for berry because the cherry just completely dominates everything. They have a guava note listed on here, and interestingly, guava technically qualifies as a berry fruit, but the cup wasn't necessarily guava-centric for me. It was a little bit more tropical in general, and that's why the other fruit notes on here, the citrus and the stone fruit, are at that level 3 mark because nothing really dominated the cup to the capacity that you couldn't taste other characteristics to it, and it had a tropical complexity within the cup itself, so that's why I was comfortable charting both of those at the level 3 because I could even justify something like a mango, and definitely in terms of the citrus, again, that's going to be that apple-like acidity. Best place I can spot that apple is in the citrus, but even then it was a little bit more of a kind of citric tropical fruit too, to kind of complement the stone fruit as well as the berry fruit aspects in this coffee. So I actually like charting all of those fruits in a moderate to higher level on this coffee. While we're on the level 3s, let's discuss the chocolate. The chocolate is at a level 3, and I think one of the other things they listed on here was cacao, and I am more than happy with it being at that level 3. And interestingly, it was actually on the lower side of the level 3. It's one of those things where when I got to the chocolate, I had to think about it because it wasn't on the forefront of this coffee. And typically with the heavier processed coffees, I'm kind of thinking the one we reviewed from Luminous earlier this year, those two things, the chocolate as well as the cherry, are so heavy and dominated the cup so much that those things reached a level 4 and higher, and that was complemented with a level 4 or higher. I think it was level 5 in the finish. And as a result, I couldn't taste the other things. So having the chocolate toned down was wonderful. It's not overly pronounced either. I could even justify that one at a level 2. But when you really kind of think about it, you can feel it in this coffee. And then I'm going to skip to the body because the body was also a little lighter body than I think I was expecting for this coffee. And now the two things I've avoided discussing because they're by far the most important things of this coffee. We'll start with the sweetness at a level 3. Yes, this coffee has nice sweetness, but none of it is overly heavy. It's slightly candied sometimes, and it's definitely more of a fruit sweetness. But even then, it's not the most wild finish. It's not the most wild sweetness, I should say, for this coffee. So it's in good level of sweetness, but nothing that really justifies that level 4. It's not necessarily a sticking point to me, and I'll get to why that is later. Most important thing of this coffee is the cleanliness at a level 3, and it is actually a high side of that level 3, and I could justify a level 4, granted a lower side of the level 4 for the Chemex, but this coffee was actually clean, and that really made this coffee work. Because again, naturals, anaerobics, they have rarely reached above the level 2 mark recently. This one is a huge exception because this one has great clarity to it, and even so to the point where I could have justified that level 4 mark. That made the rest of this coffee work, and I think it just made the cherry and chocolate, which I haven't enjoyed in so many other of these coffees, work much better in this one than those other ones. But yeah, that's kind of it for the tasting wheel. Very similar along with the Chemex, very similar cups of coffee regardless of which brew method. Maybe even the body a little lower, but probably still stick at that 2, and the cleanliness maybe underly justified at that level 4, but regardless, I think this tasting wheel is pretty good for both brew methods. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one definitely exceeded my expectations. Honestly, when I knew that this was going to be a heavier processed coffee, I really wondered what I was going to get, and I was hoping it wasn't another one of those coffees that I didn't like by any means. But this one gives me a little hope that there are naturals out there that can still have some clarity to them and great structure, because this had all of that. So this one is one of the better natural processed coffees I've had this year, and it should be stated that I really love Hartmann coffees. They've been one of my favorite farms my entire life, so I really love the fact that this coffee didn't come out overly heavy, because I was very concerned that that was what's going to happen with this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, there are a lot of people. If you're still looking for something on the cleaner side of natural processed coffees that still have great vibrancy to it, this one did. Now, while it wasn't necessarily the sweetest, it was made up for by the fact that the acidity was nice and kind of bright, but not overwhelming. The cherry was also nice and bright, oftentimes a little candied, while complemented by great fruit complexity as well. So there are abundance of reasons why you might enjoy this coffee as much of the extent as I did, because I always think that Panamanian coffees, especially the non-geishas, are worth trying for anybody that's maybe not had too many Panamanian coffees in their life. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Hartmann Family Natural Catuai, natural processed Panama from Standout. Thank you for watching.